live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Faculty Focus, an event sponsored by the Association of American Law Schools. We're going to wait just a few more seconds here and make sure that everyone gets a virtual seat, so to speak. We have quite a few people participating. So bear with us just a moment and we'll get started. We know this is a busy time of year for a lot of you, a lot of transitions going on, and you have a lot of choices, and we are glad that you chose to spend a little time with us today at Faculty Focus. So we'll begin very, very shortly. All right, I think let's begin. Well, welcome. My name is Jeff A.I.M. I'm the Director of Research and Data Analytics at the Association of American Law Schools, and I'm the moderator of Faculty Focus. This is a weekly conversation intended for tenure-track faculty, clinical, legal writing, and other non-tenure-track faculty regarding the pressing issues of our time. And today, we have a terrific lineup that's going to be talking to us about racism, justice, and your fall classes. We've asked each of our speakers to provide a 5-minute talk, followed by with a little bit of conversation with our co-hosts, and at the end, there will be some questions and answers. Now, all attendees will be muted during this event, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. We really do. Please feel free to use the chat feature, as well as the Q&A feature in Zoom, so that you can engage with our participants and our co-hosts throughout the event. Please also know that this will be recorded. We know that not everybody could make it today, and we want to make sure that all of our target audience has a chance to watch this. So in a couple of days' time, this will be available on the AALS website. Just sign in using your credentials. And now I'd like to introduce our co-hosts. First, Darby Dickerson. Darby's the AALS president and the dean of the University of Illinois John Marshall Law School. And Vince Rougeau, the AALS president-elect and the dean of the Boston College School of Law. Darby, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jeff. Welcome everyone to this week's Faculty Focus, where we'll be addressing how to discuss issues related to racism and injustice in our classrooms. With the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many more having raised the national consciousness, it's important that we learn effective ways to discuss these issues with our students. Law has been part of building systems of injustice and racism, and we need to be both a leading voice and force in reconceptualizing those systems in a way that truly advances life, liberty, and justice for all. In addition, we want this program to be helpful to all of you. So if you have topics you want us to address in future sessions, please reach out to me, Vince, or Jeff, and let us know. And also, if you're interested in being a panelist in a future program, reach out to us as well. Vince, I'll throw it over to you.
Thanks, Darby, and just let me add my welcome to all of you. And it's a great pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. And I just want to add that we want the AALS to be an organization that supports you in every way possible throughout all the things that you do as teachers, scholars, and members of law faculties. And we hope today's program will be part of that and future programs as well. So as Darby mentioned, please do send us ideas that you may have for future programs. And I just want to close by saying, this is such an incredibly important issue for all of us in so many ways. But in this particular time when so many of our students are isolated and may not actually be returning to campus in the traditional ways, it's still very important for us to think about how we can speak to them about an issue that is having extraordinary impact on our society and on our world. So we're looking forward to the conversation and looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Vince. We have 5 great presenters here with us today. The first will be Kimberly Mutcherson, co-dean and professor of law at Rutgers Law School. Next will be Teri McMurtry-Chubb, professor of law at UIC John Marshall Law School. Leslie Culver, who is a visiting professor of lawyering skills at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. She's also a legal writing professor at California Western, where she's also the program director for A.I.M, for Law Diversity Pipeline Program. And to top it all off, she is transitioning to the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. Aman Gebru is Assistant Professor of Law at Duquesne University School of Law, and Kevin Haeberle is Associate Professor of Law and Fellow, Center for the Study of Law and Markets at William & Mary Law School. Kim, I'll toss it to you to start us off.
Thanks so much, Darby, and many thanks to Jeff and AALS and Vince for having us here to have this conversation. I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet, although we all know a law professor can take 5 minutes just to say her name. So I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet, and obviously if there are things that I say and people want me to elaborate, I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. I'm mostly going to focus on bringing race into our classrooms because, quite frankly, if you're doing the right job and doing a good job of bringing race into the classroom, you are inevitably going to talk about justice. And if you're not talking about justice, then you're not actually talking about race. I'm not going to profess to be an expert in bringing race into the classroom. I've been teaching for 18 years, so this work is work that I have been doing for a long time. And so I certainly have ideas, and I'm certainly not going to claim to be sharing best practices, which is always just a horrible term anyway, because what works for one person is not necessarily going to work for another person in the classroom, and that's true of teaching in general. You know, as Darby and Vince pointed out, this is a really special moment, and it's one I think, or at least hope, that when we get back to our classrooms, virtual or otherwise, in the fall, students are going to expect us to be able to bring more to the table than many law professors have done in the past. And I recognize that that can be very scary, especially for folks who haven't been talking about these issues in their classrooms. So hopefully we can demystify that a little bit in our conversation today. I will say that I think it's absolutely necessary that we are having these conversations in our law school classrooms. I believe very deeply that if we aren't turning out lawyers who have been properly challenged in law school to seriously consider the many ways in which law is racialized and unjust, then we're not doing our jobs. And those are not lawyers we should be sending out into the world. So there are a few principles that I think about in how I put my classes together and that I think are really important in thinking about how we teach. So the first one is the chances that you teach a class where race is not relevant are somewhere between slim and none, right? Every single class that we teach has some sort of element of how race impacts the people who are making the law, the people who are affected by the law, all of it. So I happen to teach torts and family law, South African constitutional law class, and a bioethics class called Bioethics, Babies, and Baby Making. So there are some really clear spaces in which race becomes a part of my conversation. In torts, you've got to talk about the reasonable person standard. You've got to talk about what it means to be objective. In family law, obviously, there are lots of ways in which race has impacted what families are protected in this country. So in South African con law, we're talking about apartheid. So please show me how you can do that without talking about race. So, you know, there are these places where it's really obvious. And so, and to the extent to which race lends itself to discussion across these topics, it sort of varies where I add it in, but it's always there. It's obviously easier to shape discussions about race in a class where you have materials that are already doing that work for you. And unfortunately, a lot of case books aren't very good at doing that work, which means that you have to kind of build the work yourself. So this sort of bleeds into the next thing that I want to talk about in terms of principles. And the second one is that I think it's really critical to get other people in your institution to the extent that you can. I know it might be harder to do when you're new in the building, but get other people in the institution on board. So everybody in the Civ Pro rotation is teaching the same sorts of things. Everybody in LAWR is teaching the same sorts of things, or even the same particular cases or the same law review articles. And there are a few reasons why I think that's important. One, it creates a sort of consistent message for students that this is a part of the curriculum. Certainly, if you are a person of color, I think women often get this as well. You are assumed to have an agenda when you walk into the classroom. It doesn't matter what you teach. It doesn't matter where you come from. And we're always assumed to be deeply subjective in ways that particularly white male professors are thought to be objective. So the more that you have people across the curriculum who are doing this work, the less likely it is that you're going to get the kind of pushback that frankly a lot of us are accustomed to, which is the eval that says, I wish you had taught torts and not race. I also taught torts. So Integrate and don't segregate. And what I mean by that is that sometimes when you're raising these issues as sort of, let's take a little journey and talk about race and justice for a little bit, and then we'll go back to the real material. That's only going to hurt you in the end, because again, this all should be a part of what we expect students to be learning in our classrooms. And then the last thing that I want to say is how important I think it is to listen to your students and to try not to be defensive. And I'll just say one story about that. I had a student come to me once with concerns about a particular con law professor, and this was a student of color, and the professor was a white woman who sort of professed to be very left and liberal and said that's how she was going to teach the class. And this student talked about the fact that every single day when she left con law, she cried, right? So even if you don't think race is in the classroom, I promise you it's there for your students of color who are struggling to understand how you were teaching these cases and not talking about all these things that are part of those cases. So let me leave it there and open it up for the next person. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. We'll move next to Teri.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for AALS for creating the space for us to talk about this. I have 5 points, and hopefully I'll take under a minute for each of them. And so I've phrased them as a couple of no's, K-N-O-W. So the first one is know your administration. What is the racial climate in the state and city where your school is located? This is important because if an event has happened in your specific city where your law school is located, you're going to have some different concerns about how you raise issues and the way you go about speaking about them. So, you know, a quick story, I was teaching in California for a long time. I'd long integrated the Shuttlesworth case and the Birmingham Good Friday March into my curricular materials. There were pictures of protesters and Confederate flags. And then I moved to Georgia and attempted to teach the same thing, and got a very different reaction from my students, right? So know the racial climate in the state and city where your school is located. What is the racial climate at your school? This is very important. Have there been incidents that have been happening over the course of several years that the administration hasn't dealt with? Are there sensitive issues with faculty and students that are kind of under the surface and they've been brewing? And, you know, so make sure you make yourself aware of those. And third, under know your administration, is your administration going to support you when you get pushback from students and colleagues? This is extremely important, right? Because our work is facilitated by administrators who are compassionate and kind and understand what the climate is in our respective places where schools are located in our classrooms, but our work is hindered by those who may not be as progressive or willing to listen. So it's important that you know that, and this shouldn't deter you, but again, you have to have a sense of the playing field and what strategies you might need to navigate that. The second is know your limitations. As Dean Mutcherson said, you'd be hard pressed to find a class where race is not involved, but also understand that when you're dealing with cases involving challenging subject matter, the option no longer exists for you to ignore issues of difference that arise. I call this the elephant in the elevator. You ignore these things at your peril. And so what does this mean for you? Well, you have got to read. Scholars have studied issues around difference and written about it. Take that work seriously. Do the work. Do not ignore the scholars at your university and your law school who have been doing this work long before it was popular to do so. Read their work and approach them respectfully for help. And I also want to say a bit about faculty of color. Each faculty of color has their own experiences with white supremacy, but not all faculty of color are experts in the area of race and white supremacy. So make sure you understand that. And another thing about your colleagues of color, they are doing emotional labor by being in the room, staying in the room, and having conversations with you. So understand that this is additional labor on top of just navigating the world as a person of color and as a faculty of color at their respective institutions. My last point is expect challenges. We are in the middle of a global pandemic. So attempting to change your classes in the best of times can be challenging. Adding issues of synchronous and asynchronous classes, unease, uncertainty about the future. People don't like change under the best of circumstances. So now you're asking a lot, right, of yourself and of your colleagues to now kind of integrate these issues into their teaching materials at a time where teaching has become challenging and we can't just rely on old strategies that have gotten us through. Next, under expect challenges, not everyone's going to appreciate your efforts to talk about race in the classroom. You will get pushback from students and colleagues, and it's important that you expect that pushback and you have strategies on how to deal with it. And last but not least, also expect extraordinary moments of joy, not just for your students, but for yourself. Be patient and allow your students the grace to make mistakes, and also allow yourself the grace to make mistakes. Thank you.
Thank you, Teri. We'll move now to Leslie.
Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you, AALS, for creating this space for us, has already been stated. I too will follow my mentor's footsteps and see if I can knock out all of my points in under a minute or less apiece. So I have three sort of broad things that I want to talk about. Let me just name them out loud. Social location, making conversations contextual, and then I want to talk about a cultural identity pyramid exercise that I use. So I've been teaching for over 12 years, and I've always been in a non-tenure track space. So I understand the tiptoeing through some of these conversations. And as of late, with my scholarship and things like that, I do also, I'm very mindful of what can I say and how can I do it carefully. So social location, let me just jump right into that. I think as a starting point, we have to understand that our social location is invaluable. It allows us to understand the multiple identities that each of us carry, that each of us have, that nobody is like some homogenous, just sort of mono creature. It doesn't matter whatever race you are. We all are coming with various identities, be it from class, economics, gender, ethnicity, whatever it is. And appreciating the social location that you are standing from in front of the classroom, I think is very helpful. That is something that I own when I come into the classroom, and in certain spaces, I acknowledge that where appropriate to my students, depending upon the exercise that we may be doing. But if I detach myself and act as though I'm sort of this objective, neutral being, and then try to have some of these conversations, it's not going to work. I no longer believe in objectivity. I don't believe in neutrality. We are all coming from some type of biased viewpoint, depending upon how we have sort of grown and how we have experienced the world. So I think acknowledging your social location is very important for those of us that are in the dominant group. Acknowledging that you have privileges, acknowledging that they exist and that they are real. But then there may be spaces where you are not as privileged in some settings. So also acknowledging that. I acknowledge that even as a Black woman, I have a JD. I'm not in a lower class setting. I have privileges, and to sort of act like I don't have them and thus I am the same as every other whatever sort of person, it's not fair. It's not fair and it's not real. So in each situation, I may have an advantage and a disadvantage. And I think when I pose that to my class in that way, everybody can kind of feel like, okay, yeah, I'm coming from this lower class. And they don't, my white students don't feel like they're being beat upon because they're white, but they're like, oh yes, I'm coming from this lower class, or this is my experience, or this is my experience. And it provides some talking points, I think, for students across the board to be able to find some place of similarity to start some of these harder conversations. Cross-racial dialogue also, I think, and sticking with the social location concept, cross-racial dialogue really requires that the professor not keep themselves at a distance. So if you have not engaged in the work of understanding yourself as a racial being, start there. It's not fair to ask that of your students, to engage in these very hard conversations, and you have been unwilling to do them yourself, and to put yourself out there and to admit where you have a privilege, to admit where you are disadvantaged, whatever it is, and then ask that of them. They are looking for us to be leaders, and part is, as already been stated, we have to do the work. We have to get educated. We have to do the research. We have to understand where our blind spots are. The second thing that I would say is that the conversations that you want to raise in the classroom, they have to be contextual. Race is not a theory. It's not this abstract idea. It is a lived experience by every single person. When you walk into the room, when you leave the room, you go to Costco, Target, wherever you go, or not go, wherever it's pandemic, right? Wherever you think you want to go, your race, even as a social construct, right? We know it's not a biological thing. Even as a social construct, it is still following you. It is a lived experience. And so when we bring it into the classroom, it's not something that I can just put on the syllabus on day 3 and say, okay, well, let's talk about race today. So we have to think contextually, how am I gonna naturally and organically bridge this conversation in, and perhaps depending upon whatever subject you're teaching, right? So as already been mentioned, you're teaching torts. How do you use material to bring this conversation in from the very beginning? I teach legal writing and lawyering skills, legal methods. And so I have to think about that, right? I'm like, okay, well, we're going to be talking about, whatever standard of review, or how do I bring race into this? But it's more so about the framework for me, right? What's the framework that I'm going to ask students to organize their conversation? What's the framework that I'm going to use to ask students to think about something? And I can think about frameworks that embrace varying perspectives. So that allows the context to make sense as we bring all of these things up. The last thing I want to mention is a specific exercise that I do, and I'm happy to share it with anybody that's interested, but I do a cultural identity pyramid exercise. This also has context. I raise it during the portion of the semester when we're going to talk about client lawyering, because from the statistics, context, ABA 2019 statistics, the profession is 85% white, 62% male. Context matters. When our clients will look at the attorneys and presume them competent, they're not thinking of me. They are not presuming me competent, and it matters that all my students understand that and know that, so they can, one, be prepared. What does that look like? I'm going to maybe get some pushback, but I am good and I have earned the right to be here. So how do I navigate that? But then also thinking about, well, this can be an experience of my clients as they go into a predominantly white sort of justice system, right? I'm understanding their experience, and how do I make sure that their voice is heard? So this exercise puts me at the forefront to sort of say, these are my identities. This is what I walk by. This is how I know I'm perceived. It allows my students to do the same things, and it opens up a conversation and a dialogue that, again, gets everybody thinking about their social location. So I will end there, and I can talk more if needed in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. We'll move next to Aman.
Great, thank you for the panelists before me, because I think they touched on the key things that I also wanted to touch on. So I'll just, in an effort to avoid repetition, I'll touch on the ones that I think is a new contribution. So as a junior faculty, so I'm finishing the first year of teaching at Duquesne. I was teaching at Cardozo Law School as a visiting assistant professor before then. So, I've only been teaching for 3 years in US law schools, but I think I've learned some things, and I also want to learn more from my colleagues. So I'm going to, I guess, give you the kind of the fresh professor perspective. So being junior is risky, of course, as mentioned earlier, but it's also, I think there's an opportunity there in that you're a new person coming in with new perspectives, and the students could also expect new perspectives from you. So I have 4 points that I'm going to touch on, but before I get to them, I just wanted to make sure that I'm situating the comment in terms of a broader context. So as we all know, racial justice has been obviously in the front and center right now, but it's also been, tied to the history of the US for, as long as the country has existed. So we shouldn't only focus on racial justice issues when protests such as the George Floyd protest happened, but, really think of these things as important, especially in law schools. And so even if something that isn't, something doesn't happen in the fall, I think we should include something on race, justice, inclusion, and diversity. And I think the generation of students that we're going to welcome into our classes already recognize these are important things. And so I think we have, not for every student, but I think it's easier to talk to the incoming class of law students. The other thing I also wanted to say is, I think Kim mentioned this, some courses are easy in terms of obviously including race, justice issues and the like. So common law might be easier, for example, than property law. So I teach property, but then I'm going to talk about how actually property is one of those courses where you can rethink some of the assumptions. And so even if the way courses have been taught in the past makes them so that they're not easily kind of, you can't easily bring in race into the class, I think you can rethink them. And as a junior person, I'm doing that with my colleagues. Luckily, I also have other colleagues that are junior and some are senior. And so we have this conversation of bringing in new content kind of to drive away from what has traditionally been the black letter law, for example, in property. So the 4 points that I would like to quickly touch on is, the first is kind of focusing on oneself and teaching style. So us, the professors. The other is thinking in terms of program and course level work that we can do. The third is rethinking the content of the courses. And lastly, consulting relevant resources that would pop up during this protest, but also resources that we already have during normal times. Normal in quotations, of course. So teaching style, ensuring, for example, a welcoming class for uncomfortable conversations, right? We need to have those uncomfortable conversations if we're able to pass through, systemic racism, police brutality, all of these things that we want to avoid. So we need to have those uncomfortable conversations in class with students that might not agree with our point of view as professors as well. So, but to say, whatever your view, feel comfortable to speak in class. But of course, the other side of that is there has to be a respectful conversation, right? So it's not personal, it's about ideas. So fostering an environment where that could happen and students feel confident to do that. The other is, and this is coming out of the spring semester where we all of a sudden need to move online and we're adjusting to it. One of the things that came up, at least at Duquesne, is me and my colleagues organized social hours online on Zoom. And that was a really interesting context when all of these things were happening, where students were actually talking to us more freely about things that are happening personally to them or family members. And so if in the fall we continue to be online, I think it's really important to create this platforms for students to talk to us as human beings, and not the professor that's going to grade me at the end of the course. So I think that's important, creating the situations. Thank you. And then also working on oneself in terms of taking, say, implicit bias training, because we all have some biases. And so taking these trainings, I think, help us improve us as human beings as well. The other is looking at program and course level objectives. Of course, in this instance, you have to work with colleagues and the law school leadership. For example, at Duquesne, we have the Dean's Diversity Action Council, and we changed it to action because I think we thought action is needed, not just conversation. So I think other law schools can think of that as well. Course level of objectives. I'm thinking of, instead of just teaching the cases in property law, for example, I've included with my colleagues, I've included critical law review articles, blogs, podcasts, and the like that question, for example, the first 2 weeks of property that just says, why we have property law. And the casebook might initially just talk about black letter law, but we've included all of this, Native American perspectives, right, international perspectives. And so rethinking the content that way as well. So bleeding into the third concept that I wanted to talk about. So rethinking the first weeks of the course, but also making sure that whenever you talk about any case that brings up minorities, women, and other groups, to link back to the first couple of weeks and say, remember that critical article that we talked about, do you agree how the court looked at this issue in front of it? And I've done that in the other course that I'm teaching, which is intellectual property law. And normally intellectual property law was thought to be neutral and doesn't really have, different impacts in terms of race, but more recently, a lot of scholars have actually highlighted, the really interesting impacts that intellectual property law has had on race, right? And so making sure that this new scholars that are maybe not in the mainstream are into your classrooms. Their law review articles are mentioned in your classrooms, and students have those resources to consult. And lastly, I just want to mention, when these things happen, we do have a lot of resources, and people have been working on this topics for a long period of time. So for example, AALS has a webpage looking at race, diversity, inclusion. I've really liked getting emails through the AALS section for property and intellectual property. And so sometimes those emails could be too much, but I think there's a lot of resource that we can use from those section emails. And lastly, there are national and international NGOs working to tackle racism. So NAACP, Southern Poverty Land Center, for example, and many others. The United Nations has a lot of resources, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. So there are resources out there. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. But I think we can use these resources to improve our teaching. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Aman. We'll next move on to Kevin.
Great, thanks for having me. I'm going to pick up on something that Kim said and that Aman just talked about a little bit. There's room for discussions of social justice and race in all of our classes. I teach securities litigation, corporations, and broker-dealer and exchange regulation. And I've spent the last 7 years focusing on market microstructure economics and the effects that it has on secondary markets for financial instruments. And a lot of my classes focus on those very narrow areas. But a number of topics come up throughout the semester, and they tend to be some of the more interesting things and the things that we can engage students on even more than on some of the core finance issues. Now, I realize that many people in this audience, maybe even most or all, don't teach these courses and aren't in the business law area necessarily, but there are issues that come up outside of even the business law classes, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about them today. One has to do with the ability of corporations to pursue social justice initiatives that aren't core to their business, and the other has to do with divestment. So I'll talk about them each in turn and try to do as much justice as I can to them in this short amount of time. First and foremost, there's some controversy, of course, over what the role of a corporation is in our society. Whatever the controversy is, and even if you believe that the corporation's goal is to improve the welfare of shareholders and no one else, corporate directors under the law today have a large amount of discretion to pursue social initiatives, including philanthropy. There are many who challenge that, and there's an interesting debate to be had about the extent to which corporations should be allowed to pursue social initiatives, but it's very clear under Delaware law that they're allowed to do this. Now, it's justified mostly by saying, well, the initiative that we're pursuing is actually good for our core business. And I think there's an economic rationale underlying this great discretion that we allow corporations and their directors to have in this area to pursue these social initiatives. And that's it. There's a market for the stock of the company. If you don't think that what the directors are doing is maximizing shareholder value, and you don't want to own the corporation stock anymore, you can sell the stock. If enough people sell out of the stock because there's so much concern that the directors are not maximizing value, in that case, you have a situation where management gets a clear signal from the market that it's not acting in the ways that shareholders want it to act. So there's a lot of discretion for management to do this. Lawsuits that challenge corporate philanthropy and the like have often been dismissed. The exception is where the corporate directors and executives are pursuing their own interests and not pursuing those of shareholders. It's not even a colorable claim that they have that they're pursuing the interests of the firm, such as when you endow chairs in a famous case at a university in the names of your directors. That is charity, but of course the chairs were being endowed in the names of the directors because the directors are the ones who set the management's pay and other restrictions on their activity. So one thing that I want to talk about was this wide discretion that courts have. And I wanted to point you to a blog post by Professor Bainbridge at UCLA. It's a June 8th blog post. And he does a very nice job of responding to a tweet that challenges Airbnb for donating money to Black Lives Matter at a time when Airbnb was struggling financially and laying off 2,000 employees. And Professor Bainbridge does a nice job of explaining why corporate directors should not be second-guessed in making that decision. So I'll leave my comments on corporate discretion to pursue social initiatives, including race-based ones, to that. And then I'll move on in my last minute to talk about divestment. So divestment is the opposite of investment. And it comes up in environmental law classes today, but also in corporate classes, and I would assume in a wide range of classes. There are prominent social issues where people say, we take issue with what's happening in society, therefore we should divest from companies that are furthering what is happening in society. It can be climate change, it can be race-based, it can be apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s. Here, the finance literature teaches us something different than what the finance literature teaches us in terms of corporate discretion and pursuing different opportunities at the firm. Here, what we learn is that divestment, which is, once again, something that's been pushed for university endowments in terms of corporate socially responsible investing, we learn that divestment is actually not something that's effective as a form of protest or as a form of furthering the goals of the parties that are pursuing it. The financial economic literature from the 1980s on apartheid showed that divestment from South African companies did not affect their cost of capital. There are other sources of capital that come in and drive down the cost of capital. They see a good opportunity to purchase a cash flow that will produce a certain amount. I don't want to get too financy, and I'm over my time, but I'll say that there's a big push to get university endowments and others to divest from certain businesses, and I don't think that's the best place to go with various movements today. That said, there's an interesting conversation to be had about it in our classes. I do think it should be informed by finance as well. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Kevin. Actually, we had two questions that were very subject matter specific, and one was about the subjects that you addressed. So, one question was asking, how do I bring issues of race into these more business-oriented courses? And I think you gave us a wonderful example of ways that these issues can be brought into those types of courses. And I would encourage folks who are in that subject matter field to chat directly with Kevin too, if you have some more specific questions in that regard. But a second question was from an area that one might think of as more traditionally associated with these kinds of conversations, with conversations about race in the classroom, and that was regarding the current issues around policing and the protests that we've been seeing. So the question is, how do we have those conversations? One, the questioner said that a faculty colleague brought into the class how evidence rules would be used in terms of dealing with protesters, and a lot of students were upset with that conversation and with that approach. So I wonder if anyone might want to offer some thoughts on that specifically. Maybe Teri, you were talking a little bit about raising those kinds of questions based on the community in which you found yourself. So this might be a good place to talk about that.
Vincent, yeah, so students are going to be upset. Black students especially are going to be upset. So I think you have to expect that this is upsetting subject matter. I mean, so navigating it as a faculty in the classroom is part of not having unrealistic expectations that we're going to have a really calm conversation about policing when I can go outside, my nephew can go outside, my father could go outside, my brother could go outside and be the subject of what you're seeing on the television. So it's very real, it's very visceral, very immediate. And so I would say, expect to have an uncomfortable conversation about these topics, but beyond that, for me, it goes back to how you frame the course and how you frame the discussion of the topics in it as well. So if I were teaching a course on evidence, I would have to talk about the historical roots of how evidence evolved. And so for instance, just with the rules around if something is prejudicial or probative, those have racial roots in how they are employed in trials, etc. And so if you frame it, the students are looking through that lens and they're seeing, oh, in every single case that we talk about in evidence, then there is a racial dynamic, there is a bigger dynamic. One way to also manage how emotions are running high in the class is to kind of, as Leslie said, you can't expect your students to be more vulnerable than you are. And you also have to set some ground rules where students aren't being forced to defend their humanity. So there's just certain things we're not going to debate. We're not going to debate whether slavery was okay. We're not going to debate whether the Holocaust was, we're just not going to have that conversation. Those are not conversations I'm willing to have in my class. And also positioning yourself to take the heat for students who are least likely to do that. Students should never have to take the heat at all, but make sure that you are the shield, you are the person that is drawing that fire away from them to be responsible, because you never want to have a situation where the students are already being vulnerable and then are being damaged further by conversations that you're facilitating badly in the classroom. So that's what I would say.
Thanks so much. Actually, you touched on a point that is the subject of another question, so I'll throw this one out. And I'm going to read this just because I want to make sure I get it. I think I lost it. Anyway, but it had to do with the issue of dealing with very conservative or other ideologies in the class that you may find offensive or sort of unsupportable or outside the norm, beyond the pale. But I think someone mentioned, I think it was you, Teri, that there are going to be communities where those standards vary. And it may be kind of tricky, particularly for someone untenured, to make that judgment call in a classroom setting where, it's particularly when they're under evaluation by their colleagues. So maybe someone could share an experience that they've had with, the kind of, I was going to say fringe, but let's not even say fringe. Let's just say with the kind of extremism that's a part of our normal politics in this country increasingly, and actually sometimes, at least from the outside looking in, might seem almost mainstream at times. Hard question.
I have an extreme example of how to deal with that, but I don't want to talk if someone else has an example.
Why don't you go ahead? We have other questions. So.
Well, I had a student who I taught in Washington State for a while, and at a very progressive university and a very progressive college within a university. But this student had been raised on the I-5 corridor in a white supremacist camp. And so he attended my class every day with mirrored sunglasses on. I could never see his affect. And so one day I'm working late in the office, and to picture this, like my office was in the mountains. And so I was, prone to stay there late, and, so it's kind of isolated. And so I get a call on the phone, and there's some students who are out with the student who had been raised in the camp. And they said, "Professor MC, this student just said he wants to kill you." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, what are you talking about?" And they're like, "Well, he has several gun permits. He's on antipsychotic medication. And he says like he wants to kill you." So immediately, of course, the dean is contacted. We go into like lockdown procedures. I'm being followed around literally by campus security. I'm being told to get a gun. All of this. We're in a meeting one day, and the university council is there, and all of the administration is there, and they say, "Well, we're more afraid of you suing us than him suing us, so we're just going to dismiss him." I said, "Absolutely, you're not going to dismiss him. No, you're not, because immediately he's going to come to my house, which was also in the mountains, and the police response was going to be a good 25 minutes, and then I would be another statistic. So we were not going to dismiss him." But all of that aside, my safety was paramount. But the takeaway here is that, for me, I wanted to understand this student. I wanted to understand how he was raised and why he felt the way he felt. I mean, he's raised growing up with guns, shooting Black people as targets, for target practice, all of this stuff. I wanted to understand, like, what is this group around the I-5 corridor about. And so I spent some time reading people who had written about this, trying to understand him. And I fought for him to stay in school. Now, he wasn't going to be in my class anymore, but I fought for him to stay in school. And I remember about 6 months later, we were in an elevator. I saw him come in the building, and I was in the elevator, and he jumped in the elevator with me. And this was like a big guy, and you can't tell from him sitting down, but I'm like, maybe 5 feet. I like to say I'm 5 feet, but probably less. And I'm in the elevator with this guy, and it was the longest elevator of my life. I'm like, I'm in a steel box. If he kills me, like, no one's gonna hear me. And so he was going to a meeting with my dean. In the meeting with the dean, he was like, oh, I was with Professor MC in the elevator, and I don't like her. I'm no longer in her class. I'm no longer at this college, but I'm still at the university, but she did this. And the dean told him, without her, you wouldn't be in school. And he burst into tears and was crying. And long story short, he ended up finishing his degree. And he had a little bit more compassion, and he thought about people a little differently because of the way I had interacted with him. And so the main takeaway is that our students at their core are people. They come with experiences, they come with their various identities, and it's incumbent upon us to try to listen to them. Again, I'm not going to defend my humanity, but I can try to meet you where you are to the extent that that's possible.
Thanks, Teri. What about the situation where we're teaching to a class where there's maybe only one or very few students of color? How do we navigate those conversations or these conversations in that situation? And I'm going to collapse another question into this by saying, we want to work hard, obviously, not to make our students of color the spokespersons for the group that they are a part of. But at the same time, we don't want to ignore the reality of their situation in that experience. So maybe some tips on that. How about Leslie, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you. That's been most of my life. So here we go.
I thought so.
Yeah, I'm like thinking back to high school, flashbacks, just went back to high school. At its core, it is our job as the educator, as the professor, as the instructor to be educated. We have to be. It's not fair to put that onto any student two things wrong with that, but it's not fair to put that on any student to be the spokesperson for any race or any particular viewpoint. It also essentializes that whole situation to suggest that their particular viewpoint then is the viewpoint of the entire race or the entire group or whatever it is. So it's also not fair to the other students in the environment to be like, oh, okay, we heard from Leslie. Okay, that's the Black perspective. Check that off my list. I understand it now. So when we have to come in being educated and understanding, again, as we've already talked about, what our blind spots are so that we can bring in all of the various viewpoints. And then if that person wants to join in, great. But I have been surprised to hear viewpoints not come from the person you might expect visibly to be giving sort of a particular stance on something. So I'm always surprised at how my students impress me with where they have different knowledge points that I wouldn't have been mindful of, if you sort of just always sort of point to the visible person in the room. So it is incumbent upon us as the professors to stay educated in that. The other thing that I would say is that if in the small section of legal writing, I get to do this and I'm privileged to do this, so I count my blessings to be teaching what I teach, is that when I know something may be coming up that could be sensitive to a particular group or small group or one or some people, if I know in advance and I have that relationship, that's key. If I have that relationship with that student, I might be able to sort of say, this is coming up. I don't want you to sort of feel any pressure or anything like that. But I have to have that relationship with them. If I don't really have that relationship and I'm watching sort of their body language during the conversation as we're talking, I will follow up. I'll follow up with any student as I'm watching them as we're having conversations, just to kind of see if they sort of shut down a little bit and normally they're vocal or whatever it is. And I will follow up with students just to say, hey, I noticed you were a little bit more quiet today. Is everything okay? Are you good or whatever? So I think being sensitive to how students are responding to certain things in the room can help, and you might open up something, but certainly just getting it out of your mind that any particular student should be the spokesperson for something. We have to be educated.
I want to start to something that I haven't seen explicitly in the questions, but it seems like we have an opportunity to explore it given our panel. And I want to address this to you, Aman. You mentioned that you had experience as either a student or a faculty member outside of the United States. And, you know, a lot of our classroom spaces now are very international, very globalized. And our students of color, for instance, are often from global backgrounds, international backgrounds. And of course, there are students who are not of color who are from international backgrounds. How do we navigate these conversations when we have a globalized class, when we have people who are bringing very different historical ideas about race, the cultural, historical situations and cultural ideas about race and racial justice to the classroom?
Thank you for raising that question. That was one of the things that I was actually thinking about mentioning in the first comment. So I'm originally from Ethiopia. That's where I went to law school. And then I was teaching for a couple of years before moving to the US. And then I also moved to Canada for an SJD degree. And so I've seen what law schools have done in the 3 jurisdictions that I've been involved in. And so I think to first animate the answer in terms of larger points, I think you can find problems or examples of problems from outside of the US, but also examples of solutions. And I think there are more on the second aspect of innovative solutions that countries have found to racial injustice. And so I think you can draw on both aspects, especially if you have international students. And again, I agree with Leslie's point about not making that person the spokesperson, but to say, you know, to have that conversation openly and invite the student, not calling out by name, but invite them through that opportunity of a conversation to make a point. And so, yes, people can, for example, cite apartheid in South Africa and have some radical comments or radical thinking of maybe justifying apartheid or trying to link it to race theory. But I think there are also people who have been fighting that and you know, have received or have received global attention in terms of innovative solutions, right? Mandela being one of the examples, right? So peaceful resolution to something that's very, you know, unacceptable to a lot of people around the world. So I think you can bring that to the US and say that's one solution. The other thing I wanted to say is the Canadian government at least had, you know, decades-long conversation with its native population. And what I really liked is there was a report that came out a number of years ago, I think 4 or 5 years ago now, that basically called out for a blanket reform in terms of government, courts and the like. And one of the things that the report focused on is law schools. So the report, this is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, had specific suggestions for law schools, specifically rethinking the whole program level objectives, but also one calling for specific courses on Native Canadians, but also making sure that every course includes that conversation. So I think we can bring solutions that other countries have already implemented and bring it into the US law schools, I think.
Thanks so much. Here's a question, and this actually it flows naturally from what you were just telling us, Aman. What about diversity in our curricula? How do we integrate these issues into curriculum planning, conversations about curriculum overall? I thought maybe I would ask that first to you, Kim, and then maybe have you follow up, Kevin.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think this is a moment where, again, lots of folks are trying to figure out how to do something that they haven't done before. And I was actually just talking to a student before this started who was sort of saying, just tell everybody that they have to teach blah, 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 blah. And I was like, let me explain tenure and let me explain academic freedom, right? So there are some things I can do and some things that I can't do. But I think one of the things that we can do is make it easier for professors to have these discussions. And I mean 2 things by that. One is have opportunities for professors to have training, and training sort of sounds really trite in this context, but you know, the ability to actually you know, role play, being in a classroom and having discussions that are really difficult and sometimes uncomfortable discussions can be really useful. And the other thing is something that I mentioned before, which is, you know, encouraging the people who are already doing this work many of whom are going to be people of color, many of whom are going to be women. And so we'll go back to that emotional labor point. But saying, look, you don't have to do this from scratch, right? Here are some ways that I've been doing it. Here are some resources that you can access. Remind people that Google is their friend, right? There are lots of ways that we can gather this kind of information and then incorporate it into our classes. So I think you really have to create a culture. And for lots of our schools, it's a cultural shift. But you have to create that culture in which everybody is thinking about, how do I make sure that this is a part of what I put into this institution and what students get when they take any of my classes.
Did you have any thoughts on that, Kevin? I wanted to give you a chance to add.
Yeah. Once again, I teach corporate law, securities law, and broker-dealer and exchange regulation. And there's a challenge in engaging the students throughout the semester, especially midway through and later on in the semester when we get a little deeper into the rules that are intricate, nuanced, and not always the most interesting thing to spend time with. People tend to be more interested in the basic structure of these markets and then the broad regulatory lines, and you get into the nitty-gritty at a certain point. What I do to try to keep the students engaged is I try to pull things off the headlines in the newspapers from the various blog posts that legal academics and others have. And I try to incorporate social issues and connect them to the topics that we're talking about. It isn't always easy, but they come up more often than you would think. Corporate boycotts, Dick's Sports decision to not sell AR-15 assault rifles and the like, had fascinating responses from consumers and also responses from the market for capital for Dick's Sports, which is a publicly traded firm. And this all ties into the various disclosure rules that companies have that allow you to learn more about them and what effects different stances they take on social issues have on their bottom line, and on more. So I do my best to pull things off the headlines to engage the students.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks to our audience as well. This has been a fantastic discussion, and I hope that we've all drawn something from this. I know I learned a lot, and I think there were so many takeaways from this conversation. I hope that many of you will choose to join us next week when our topic will be the dean's perspective. We have 3 deans who will be talking about how they'll go about operating their law schools for the fall semester. And then we also have 3 junior faculty who are going to be talking about their preparations for the fall semester. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.